All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, hello, and thank you all so much for coming to the Watershed Wednesdays webinar series. This evening's session is Mental Health in the Age of Compounding Disasters with Andrew O'Mara. This presentation will run approximately 45 minutes. We'll have time for questions at the end, so please use the Q&A box to submit those. If you would like to drop comments into the chat box, feel free to do so. Make sure that the chat box is set to go to everyone. So again, use the Q&A for any questions and set your chat box to everyone. My name is Amanda Cabanillas. I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Greene County Soil and Water Conservation District, or GCSWCD. This webinar series is being offered as part of 2023's Schoharie Watershed Month, which is a month-long series of free community events that celebrate and raise awareness of the waterways that flow across the Schoharie Reservoir watershed, as well as the 315 square miles of land across Greene, Schoharie, and Delaware counties that feed them. In addition to this evening's session, we have 2 more webinars scheduled. For more information on those, you can head to our Facebook and Instagram accounts, or you can reach out to me directly. All of the events we have hosted this month have been made possible by the Schoharie Watershed Stream Management Program, which was established in the mid-1990s to protect drinking water quality through the preservation of natural stream system stability and ecological integrity. This is a partnership between the Greene County Soil and Water Conservation District and the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. Because this is an offering to our community, we welcome you to send any ideas for future Schoharie Watershed Month events. Again, tonight's session is Mental Health in the Age of Compounding Disasters with Andrew O'Mara. Andrew is the project coordinator for the Institute for Disaster Mental Health, or IDMH. He holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from the State University of New York, or SUNY, at Potsdam, and a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling from SUNY New Paltz. Andrew has worked extensively with IDMH since 2019, advising students, planning the annual IDMH conference, and assisting in programmatic development in response to acute and chronic disasters, including during the COVID-19 pandemic. Andrew has assisted in developing and delivering content to victim service providers, mental health clinicians, and first responders, among others. Currently, Andrew is engaged in a 5-year grant from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration around supporting the mental health needs of children in Puerto Rico since 2021. Additionally, Andrew is the current instructor for the Practicum in Disaster Studies course at SUNY New Paltz, where he supervises up to 20 students per year conducting fieldwork with local government and nonprofit disaster response agencies. The IDMH also focuses on local response capabilities, with Andrew serving on several local and community and county committees, including the Recovery and Resiliency Coalition of Dutchess and Orange County Emergency Management's Family Reunification Assistance Center team. Andrew also enjoys outdoor activities such as hiking and camping, and can often be found enjoying the beautiful scenery around the Hudson Valley. So thank you so much for being here with us this evening, Andrew. I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm really happy to be here presenting on mental health in the age of compounding disasters. Funny enough, actually, May is also Mental Health Awareness Month. So I think this is a really great pairing and a very timely pairing. So as Amanda had said, I'm the program coordinator. Actually, when I sent that to you, Amanda, was before my promotion. But I'm the program coordinator at the Institute for Disaster Mental Health. We're a small translational research institute based at the SUNY New Paltz campus, just off of the thruway, right in New Paltz. So today I just wanted to give a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. So I did want to do a little bit of an introduction into the institute that I work for, what we're here for, what we do, and then getting into a little bit about the mental health impacts of floods. We're going to break down both acute and chronic flooding, as well as implications for chronic stress and compounding disasters, so acute on chronic disasters. A little bit on the role of disaster mental health in disaster response, And then we're going to end this evening with some talk about early interventions and some self-care practices and ways that our institute can help with that. So like I said, I'm from the Institute for Disaster Mental Health at SUNY New Paltz. We were founded just after the attacks on September 11th, 2001. So we've been doing this for more than 20 years now. Like Amanda had said in the introduction, we also have a yearly conference. It depends on what time of year. It changes usually, but it is once a year. It's funded entirely by the New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services for both clinicians, community members, and first responders to come learn about disaster response and the importance of the mental health component of disaster response. It sort of brings me to the mission of our institute. So we do quite a few things at our institute. We do trainings for professionals, both clinical and for first responders. So we do have a advanced certificate in trauma and disaster mental health for, right now it's for clinicians. We are trying to expand that to other professionals such as teachers, lawyers, etc. We do also have an undergrad minor. It's part of our psychology department at SUNY New Paltz, specifically focused on disaster mental health, which is the course that I also teach that Amanda had mentioned in the intro. We also do trainings with first responders. So actually tomorrow morning, I'm going to be in Albany doing a training for the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services personnel. So we do have a couple of contracts with them. We do work with first responders. And then we also do work in disaster response. So like was mentioned in the intro, we've been working down in Puerto Rico, our institute has, since Hurricane Maria in 2017. I've been working down there since about 2019 when I came on board at the institute. And so we have been doing some direct service. We currently have a 5-year grant from SAMHSA down there to do some work with the Boys and Girls Club of Puerto Rico, which is a community organization. They work with kids in after school programs. So they, education, childcare, also they feed them, which is a really big thing down there, which is sort of what we do, right? So we do a lot of that, that type of work, right? A lot of that training work. We always say that we're not really first responders. We're sort of like second or third responders, right? We sort of come in to help the helpers help people. So moving on into a little bit about what we're going to be talking about tonight and sort of the purpose of the discussions tonight. I'm going to move my screen over there. It's blocking some of the things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about natural disasters and specifically about flooding and how that relates to the research that's out there about natural disasters. So I first wanted to start out by talking a little bit about natural disasters compared to other types of disasters, especially human-caused disasters. So what we do know is that natural disasters are a little bit, I don't want to say easier on people, but there typically isn't as much trauma, long-lasting trauma after a natural disaster compared to a human-caused disaster. Human-caused disasters are a little bit different because there's intent to it, right? There's another person who had intent to cause harm. Whereas with natural disasters, we typically see different types of reactions, not necessarily at somebody, right? We oftentimes, and I'll get into this in just a minute, but the different kinds of reactions that we do see, right? Sometimes people will blame themselves, they'll blame the universe, they'll blame a higher power. So my point here is that the type of disaster matters, right? When we're talking about natural disasters, when we're talking about flooding, we're going to be talking about these kinds of disasters. Unlike other natural disasters, however, flooding can be caused by lots of different events, right? So this can include severe storms such as hurricanes, really bad thunderstorms, tropical storms. It can also be caused by failed or ineffective infrastructure. So the breaking of a dam, drainage systems not functioning properly, increased snowmelt, which sort of leads into changing climate patterns, right? The big question about climate change and how that's affecting natural disasters as a whole, but specifically flooding. Flooding is a really big issue when we're talking about disaster response in the world of climate change. Or it could be a combination of these or other factors, and we'll get into that a little bit later tonight about what happens during a combination of those different types of events. What's important to keep in mind here is that every event and or municipality is different in the cause of the incident the specifics of the incident, and their needs post-flooding incident, right? So even if the same municipality has different flooding events, each one could be a little bit different as far as who's impacted, what the impacts that sort of the outcomes that we see from those impacts. And then, of course, every place is going to be different, right? So we do work with a lot of first responders in New York State. So they do go all around the state where there's a need, right? And so even though it's all within New York State, every community is going to be different. Every event is going to be different. It is also important to remember, and again, we'll get into this a little bit later tonight, that natural disasters, which include flooding, also occur in the context of other social issues, other natural or other disasters. We always say that disasters don't happen in a bubble, right? They happen in the context that we're all currently living in anyway. And so all of the social issues, all of the things that are going on in that community before the flood are still going on during and after that flood. So just something to keep in mind as well. And that extreme weather events such as flooding do create different types of stress. So we have acute stress, cumulative stress, and traumatic stress. So acute stress, and I'll get into this in just in a couple slides. But essentially, acute stress, we like to say, is sort of like the snapping of a pencil. It happens all at once, and it's immediate, and it's sort of extreme. Whereas cumulative stress is more like the fraying of a rope, right? It sort of happens slowly over time, little by little. And then traumatic stress, which we won't get into as much today, can be caused by both acute and cumulative stress, but it's almost on its own, right? So traumatic stress changes the way that our brain functions and the way that our memories are stored. And so traumatic stress really impacts our brain in a different way than just acute or cumulative stress will. So I did want to go over some of the common reactions that we see to stress and trauma, right? So some of these acute stress reactions, which can lead to traumatic stress, right? So oftentimes we'll see emotional reactions. These are some of the most common, some of the ones that you think about so some of the reactions you think about when you think about traumatic reactions. Most of these people over here on the right-hand side, these are some examples of people having reactions. A lot of these are emotional reactions. So within emotional reactions, there's reminders that can provoke the same fear that was experienced during a trauma. So like I was saying before, during traumatic events, our brain actually stores memories differently. So it doesn't store them like most memories do. So if I was to ask anybody, what your day was like, right? What your morning was like, how you were able to, to get on to this webinar tonight, right? You can tell me the steps that you take, right? I turned on my computer, I found the link, I clicked the link, I signed into Zoom, right? There's a sort of a series of events that happen there. And after a traumatic event, those memories or the things that people remember from that traumatic event don't get stored in that kind of way. They're almost like live wires, where they're not in a structured pattern. And so certain reminders of that fear that was experienced during that traumatic event can bring up a lot of those emotional feelings. So it's almost like that person is right back in it, sort of reliving it. We oftentimes call this like a flashback, but it's not necessarily like somebody's just remembering the traumatic event. It's like they're back in that traumatic event. And so it can bring up some of those same emotional reactions. Another common emotional reaction that we see is generalized fear. So the example that we always use, which is an unfortunately common one nowadays, is a kid who was in a school during a shooting event. It might make sense to us that kid after that, or if they were in the hallway during that event, it might make sense to us that they don't want to go back to school to be in that same hallway, right? But that fear might become more generalized, where it's not necessarily that specific hallway, but now it's all hallways in the school. And now it's not only all hallways in the school, but it's all hallways anywhere. And so that kid is now going to try to avoid going into halls, and I'll talk about avoidance in just a minute. But we'll be trying to avoid going into any hallways because it brings up those reminders, those emotional reminders of the event, right? And so these sort of innocuous things can become triggers. We hear about this very, very often. I was talking to somebody recently at a training who was a firefighter during the September 11th attacks. And he said still to this day, whenever he smells the smell of a pretzel, because there was a pretzel stand across the street, it puts him right back into that moment of watching his firefighters run up into the tower. Intrusive thoughts and feelings. So like I had just mentioned as well, sort of these intrusive thoughts that push themselves in, right? It's not somebody thinking about it as much as the thought popping up, and they're not being able to get rid of it. We also see attempts to regain control after traumatic events, especially, or not especially, but including flooding. So one of the common ones, we saw this really during COVID especially, is rises in domestic violence. So one of the things we know about disasters is it strips away people's sense of efficacy, their sense of agency, and the sense that they can do things to help themselves. And so they'll really try to regain control anywhere they can, even if that's control over other people. We oftentimes see, increases in bullying happen in schools after disasters, same kind of thing, right? Trying to regain control over something in someone's life. We also see depression or emotional numbing. So sort of those kind of emotional reactions. The thing I wanted to mention about emotional numbing especially is it's really hard to selectively, or almost impossible to selectively emotionally numb. So you can't necessarily just turn off the bad emotions and keep the good emotions. When you're emotional numbing, it's all or nothing. So it can be really hard for people to sort of feel happiness or feel joy when they're trying to really suppress all of their emotions, because letting any emotions through is going to be too much for them. We also see a loss of trust in people and a loss of trust in the world, right? So oftentimes people, especially children, have a sense that people are generally good, the world is generally a good place, and something like a traumatic event, like a disaster, can really upset that balance, right? Make people feel like the world is not a good place, people aren't here to help, and can really sort of change that worldview. Moving away from the emotional reactions, we also have cognitive reactions. So these are reactions specifically affecting memory and concentration. So first we have memory problems. It can be really hard, if not impossible, to learn something new during a traumatic event. So trying to remember something during a traumatic event. Like I had said before, right, traumatic memories are stored differently than normal memories of just our day-to-day life. And so it can be really hard to not only store those memories, but access memories. So oftentimes after a disaster, if somebody loses their house in a flood, for instance, insurance agents will come in and will ask for all these, all this information, all this documentation, which can be hard to provide anyway, right? If you've just lost everything. But even if that's something that you would normally be able to remember, it can be really hard to tap into those memories. We also see a sense of disbelief. So we'll oftentimes hear people say things like, I can't believe this happened, or I can't believe this happened to me. I feel like I'm living in a dream, right? So not being able to sort of process what's happening. Indecisiveness and difficulty concentrating. So really having trouble sort of focusing, making a list and sort of working down it can be really difficult, especially after a traumatic event. Similar with confusion or distraction, right? It can be really hard to pay attention when you feel like everything else is sort of going out of control. This is especially true with children as well, right? Oftentimes we'll see kids after a traumatic event really have trouble in school, right? It's a combination of all of this, right? The confusion, the distraction, difficulty concentrating, indecisiveness. As I'm saying this, right, you might also think that this also sounds like some common diagnoses that kids get, right? Oftentimes ADHD labels get put on kids after disasters, when really what's going on here is some of this indecisiveness, difficulty concentrating, and confusion or being distracted is related to the trauma more so than it's related to a diagnosis, if it's happening specifically after a disaster. Shame, and I'll also throw guilt in here too, is a very common one, right? Survivor's guilt, guilt about what they did or did not do, right? I should have done this, I should have done that. Why did I not do that? This can lead to distorted thinking and preoccupation with the event, something we tend to call rumination, right? So sort of thinking about the event over and over and over again, which can be really can sort of keep that trauma reaction going, right? Most trauma reactions, if they're not being fueled by anything, last about 90 seconds. If it lasts more than 90 seconds, it's because something is keeping that reaction going. I always like to say, if you think about, watching a scary movie, right? And there's a big lead up and then a big jump scare, and it turns out it's just like a fake jump scare, right? The main character goes to go open the door and it's just a bird that flies out. That sort of reaction that you have, right? If it's not kept going, if it's just sort of a gotcha moment, tends to only last a couple seconds, right? Within 30 to 60, maybe 90 seconds, your heart rate's back, you're sort of back settled again. Versus if that main character opens the door and it's the monster, right? Then your heart rate's going to stay elevated during that scene. That sort of brings me on to some of the behavioral and physical reactions. So the behavioral reactions, sort of a heightened startle response, restlessness and hypervigilance. So you tend to say sort of constantly looking over your shoulder, constantly looking out for the next threat, for the next thing that you have to look out for, as a result of the traumatic event, right? This traumatic event has impacted you in such a way that you're going to do whatever you can to try to avoid any reminders of that traumatic event or another traumatic event from happening. Withdrawal and apathy, and I'll also throw the avoidant behaviors in here as well. What we know about disasters specifically is that they really isolate people, right? They pull people away from their support systems. And what the research shows is that one of the best predictors of mental health outcomes after a disaster is the perceived level of social support that somebody has. So sort of a double-edged sword here, right? The thing that we know works the best for disaster response in a mental health context is being with people that support you, right? It's having that support from other people. But one of the most common things that happens because of trauma is that withdrawal. So it's definitely something to keep in mind, something to try to tap into. It can be really sort of insidious because it's such a big has such a big impact for people who have been through disasters, but it can also be such a big help. The avoidant behaviors, right? So like I said, with that heightened startle response, constantly trying to avoid some of the things that are bringing up some of those emotional reactions that are bringing up the reminders of that traumatic event. So we'll avoid, right? We'll avoid going to places that remind us of that. We'll avoid going near any place, that sort of brings up any of those traumatic memories, right? We'll cross the street when we smell when there's a pretzel stand, or that kid will refuse to go to school because they don't want to be in that hallway. We also see a decrease in activities, so sort of going along with the withdrawal and apathy, right? Activities that might be social, that might be enjoyable, that somebody once might have really liked doing, they're going to start to decrease those activities because of that withdrawal and that apathy. And occasionally we'll see engagement with high risk behaviors, especially if somebody's emotionally numbing, and then they're sort of trying to oftentimes hear people say, I'm just trying to feel something. Well, oftentimes they're emotionally numbing, and then they're engaging in high risk behaviors to try to offset that emotional numbing. And lastly, we also see a lot of physical symptoms. So things like elevated heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, nausea, sweating, shivering, faintness. Those are all due to those to cortisol and adrenaline, right? Those hormones in our bodies that get activated when there is a traumatic event that happens, right? That's also called the fight or flight response. And in some contexts, that fight or flight response can be really helpful, right? If there's a bear that's chasing you, you want to have your heart rate elevated and your blood pressure up and your respiration high so that you can get away from that bear. The problem is that sometimes that mechanism, that fight or flight mechanism, gets stuck on. We always use the analogy of it's like a smoke alarm getting stuck on. And so it's really hard to do anything when that smoke alarm is stuck on. So when that's stuck on, you get things like that nausea, sweating, shivering as an effect of having those hormones constantly being pumped through your body. And then sleep disturbances. So just because you go to sleep doesn't mean that those hormones stop getting activated in your body. So oftentimes we'll hear about, especially with kids, about having nightmares, or even with adults not being able to sleep through the night or having trouble getting to sleep or staying asleep. Is because your body is trying to sort of activate that startle response as you're trying to fall asleep, which can be really tough. I will also add that sleep disturbances out of all of these reactions are some of the ones that last the longest and are some of the hardest to treat also. So those are particularly insidious. Then there's also the hyperarousal. We already sort of talked about that with the heightened startle response, right? But sort of hyperarousal related to your elevated heart rate, blood pressure, that kind of thing. Somatization. So this is the physical expression of psychological symptoms. So oftentimes one of the best examples I have for this is, a kid that doesn't want to go to school because they're anxious about school, social anxiety, they're getting bullied, something like that, and they say that their head hurts or their stomach hurts, right? They're physically ill, but it's because of sort of the amount of stress that they're going through. And then we also see appetite changes as well. So when you have all of those stress hormones circulating through your body's going to it's going to be prioritizing the systems that it needs to survive, right? So it's going to be prioritizing your cardiovascular system and your respiratory system and not your digestive system. So oftentimes we see changes in appetite happen as well. And I wanted to talk a little bit about acute flooding. Then we're going to talk a little bit about chronic flooding, and then a little bit about the compounding effects of both. So acute flooding, we're going to define this as sort of the major flooding events, right? The once in a generation floods. These are oftentimes related to extreme weather events, or extreme events, I should say, oftentimes weather events. So you can think of this as your superstorm Sandys, your Hurricane Irenes, right? Your hurricanes, your tropical storms, blizzards as well, especially if it's a springtime blizzard and all that snow is about to melt. It can also be not weather related, right? So things like an infrastructure collapse, a dam collapse, a levee breaking, a sewer system not functioning properly, right, can cause major flooding. A water main breaking, right, can cause acute flooding. Acute flooding doesn't impact communities very often, right? So this isn't something that's happening constantly, but it can be very destructive when it does occur, right? Like I said, sort of the once in a lifetime, once in a decade flooding events. All communities do have some risk for acute flooding, right? Most cities have water mains that run up and down Main Street, right? If a water main breaks and it floods Main Street, that's going to be a pretty bad acute flooding event. However, geographic location can also play a major role, especially when it comes to the specific hazards. So the example that I have here is, New York versus Arizona. The flooding of the risk of acute flooding events in a place like New York, which has a lot more lakes and rivers and streams than a place like Arizona, you're going to be a little bit more at risk for acute flooding just because of those natural hazards. But it doesn't mean that cities in Arizona don't have to worry about acute floods. Acute flooding, the communities that are impacted by acute flooding usually aren't as familiar with the hazard because it doesn't happen all the time, right? So there's going to be less local knowledge about the event, about how to deal with the event, and about what to do about it, right? So you're oftentimes going to need more education about the hazard. This can also go into the mental health field when you talk about sort of what we call psychoeducation, which is a little bit of what I just gave you, right? Common reactions that you can see after a disaster. This is what to look out for, and this is what you can do about it. They may be less familiar with those in communities that haven't dealt with this type of disaster before. It can also be more difficult to anticipate some of those secondary impacts of acute flooding, such as road closures, damaged power lines, down trees, that kind of thing, because they're not used to it, right? These are communities that don't have to deal with flooding very often. And so when it does happen, it throws a wrench in their entire system. Oftentimes the mental health impacts for acute disasters can seem more severe. But I did want to add, especially in contrast to the chronic flooding, that they usually have a much more clear end, right? So although it's going to be, sort of a more intense disaster, a more intense reaction oftentimes, usually there's a clearer end to, okay, now we can sort of move onto the recovery stage. Everything's been dealt with, you're safe, we can sort of move forward. Whereas with chronic disasters, we don't always have that. And acute flooding events can be considered traumatic, especially if there's severe loss. I do want to add, especially when we're talking about flooding, that loss does not just include people, but also material losses. So the loss of your home, something like that, is going to be can overwhelm us. So essentially anything that overwhelms our normal abilities to function, right? So the snapping of a pencil. So I just wanted to mention a little bit here about the impacts of acute stress on functioning and also on resilience. So what we do know is that most people who experience a single natural acute event, so something like, like a hurricane or a severe flooding event, only about 12% of those people will go on to develop PTSD or some sort of diagnosable disorder related to that trauma. So that means around 87 to 88% of people who experience that acute event will go on to make a full recovery. So the impact here, even though it may seem severe, for the most part, people are going to be able to recover. It's really those 12% that we're looking at as mental health professionals, who really need the help. And then also, how can we reduce that number from 12% to as low as we can get it? In contrast to the acute flooding, I want to talk a bit about chronic flooding, right? So chronic flooding tends to occur in communities who are located near bodies of water, rivers, lakes, streams, occasionally oceans. And these are communities that have flooding on a semi-regular basis, right? Seasonal flooding, floodplains, snowmelt. These are communities that know to expect it, right? In New Paltz, where I currently teach, we have sort of a lowlands part of our town that floods anytime there's more than a couple inches of rain, and so that's sort of what I'm talking about here, right? Communities that they know it's going to flood, they know when it's going to flood, they know when they get rain, it's going to be an issue. Although these kind of flooding events impacts communities more often, it's typically not as destructive, right? So this isn't a once in a decade event happening twice a month, right? This isn't a flood that necessarily takes out your whole house, but maybe there's a couple feet of water in your basement. It's still a flooding event. It's still going to impact you, especially if that happens multiple times, a month, multiple times a year, multiple times in a season. Chronic flooding events do tend to impact communities that have some vulnerability to flooding, right? So what this means is that not all communities are at risk, and the risk of each community is going to be different, right? Depends what that vulnerability is. Every community that has chronic flooding, it's going to be different, right? There's a different cause to it. There's a different, proposed solutions. There's different impacts. Communities that deal with chronic flooding are oftentimes more familiar with the hazard in comparison to communities that deal with mostly acute flooding. So that local knowledge about the flooding potential, right? When is it going to flood? How much rain are we going to get until it floods? What can we do about it? Is already going to be there, right? So you don't necessarily have to come in and have a plan for everything. The community usually is going to know what to do better. And to that point, those secondary impacts can be better anticipated and better planned for, right? So like I said, there's in the part of New Paltz that will oftentimes flood, there's a road that runs through that. And oftentimes when it floods, the road will be closed. And so people know, if there's more than a couple inches of rain, that road's probably going to be closed. You have to use this other road, right? And when that happens, if you go on the town Facebook page, it's usually the top post, right? Hey, the road, the road's flooded. Use the other road. But that's definitely a local knowledge, right? If somebody's just sort of driving through, they might not know that, right? And then it's going to be a lot harder for them to be able to navigate around that hazard. The mental health impacts for chronic flooding might not seem as severe on the surface. However, it does tend to add up over time. So this is sort of the slow fraying of a rope. And it does tend to sort of wear us down slowly over time. So even though it's not as acute, it's not as severe, it's not as immediate, these impacts can be really really harmful over the long term. So I did want to talk a little bit about the effects of the compounding disasters, sort of to the title of this presentation. So when we talk about compounding disasters, especially when we're talking about flooding events, we're really talking about two things here. The first is the impacts of an acute flooding event on communities that are already susceptible to chronic flooding. So just because a community deals with chronic flooding doesn't mean they're never going to deal with acute flooding, right? Communities can definitely deal with both. And actually communities that already have that vulnerability for chronic flooding might actually be flooded even worse when an acute event happens, right? So even though, like I said, for New Paltz, for example, when we get a couple inches of rain, we know that's going to flood. But when we get an event like a Hurricane Irene or Hurricane Sandy that comes through, we know that that's going to dump much more rain, and it's definitely gonna flood as it normally, in the place that it normally does, but the impacts are going to be exponentially worse. Those communities do still have those resiliences though, right? They still have that local community knowledge on the hazard, on what to do. So do try to tap into that, even if it is an acute flooding event. What I will say too is that for those communities, they oftentimes don't need as much support. So oftentimes, during an acute flooding event, people from the state or from FEMA, right? People from higher up who aren't locals are going to try to bring all of the resources in because they think they're needed. even if they're not, because that community already has resources in place. They already know what needs to be done. So just something to keep in mind there. The other thing here when we're talking about compounding disasters is the impacts of both acute and chronic flooding on communities dealing with other disaster types. So like I said, there's always those other issues that those communities are dealing with pre-disaster that are still going to be coming up during and after the disaster. And this is especially true with compounding disasters. One of the best examples in sort of recent memory is COVID, right? So even though COVID was happening, it was sort of a chronic disaster ongoing. There was also other acute, disasters going on. There was flooding events, there was house fires, there were other things happening to people that made that a lot harder. It definitely depends on what that other disaster type is, right? So with COVID, for instance, I was working with the Red Cross as a disaster mental health worker. And I remember I was working with a specific woman who had lost her house in a house fire. And it was really hard to find a place to shelter her because we couldn't go, open up a shelter for everybody in that building who had lost their house. And so, in that situation, it was the public health disaster, right? You can't put everybody in the same room together because there's a risk of people getting sick. We need to social distance. My point here is that the different types of disasters will impact each other differently. Each has their own unique factors, and the combination of those factors is going to be additive. I just wanted to add a couple considerations for rural communities here. So due to the hazards associated with flooding, oftentimes rural communities can be more at risk. They oftentimes will have less resources, especially when we're talking about mental health resources. For a couple of years, I lived in very upstate New York, in a rural community, and it was really hard for people to get mental health resources, right? There might have only been one or two mental health professionals in that town, and if they don't take your insurance, or if they don't take insurance at all, a lot of people were out of luck. There has been a rise in the use of telehealth. There are some pros and cons there, right? So it can be helpful to help solve this problem of resources. However, especially with disaster mental health, it tends to be better to do it in person because of the nature of the work, because of the intensity of the work. It can be kind of hard to do that over the phone or over Zoom. Also, so there's something to be said about if you're in a post-disaster zone, is there computer access, is there self-service, that kind of thing as well. Increased difficulty in traveling, right? So if a road is flooded, there might be less roads in a rural community, so less ways to get around it. Might take longer to get around it. And scarcity in the means of travel. So oftentimes there's less public transit in rural communities. Rural communities are oftentimes very self-reliant, and they're oftentimes very close-knit. So there is sometimes some hesitancy to welcome outside assistance. However, what we do see is closer social bonds. And so like I had said previously, right, the one thing that we know about disasters or about recovery after a disaster is perceived social support, right? So these social bonds are a great healing factor, especially if you can get buy-in from local community leaders, really tap into that close-knitness. Also, because these communities tend to be self-reliant, there is an opportunity here for building efficacy both in individuals and in the community, right? These communities are going to be able to help themselves, and they should help themselves if they can. I just want to be conscious of time as well. So here are some common outcomes of indirect trauma exposure. I won't go into all of these in detail tonight. However, these are typically what we see when these common reactions sort of run their course. I did want to talk a bit about the importance of early interventions, especially mental health interventions. So this arrow here on the right-hand side of the screen sort of shows the timeline of an event. So over on the left, we have the distressing event happening. Then we have those immediate reactions that we covered a little bit earlier tonight. And those immediate reactions can sometimes lead to those potential long-term challenges for people. Early interventions are going to promote a sense of safety, promote a sense of calm, promote a sense of efficacy, both in the self and in the community, promote connectedness, and instill hope. And they're going to do that at the point of the immediate reactions, right? So the idea here is that if we can address those immediate reactions, we can reduce the amount of people that are going to develop those longer term challenges, hopefully get that 12% number of people that tend to develop post-traumatic stress or other clinical clinically significant disorders after a disaster lower. Whereas traditional mental health doesn't intervene until those challenges occur. There are a couple different types of interventions. So we typically, here at our institute, we use a tiered system of interventions. So these can be given at different levels of care, depending on the specific needs of that community. So we start here on the bottom with universal interventions. This can be provided to anyone at any time by anybody with the proper training. This is oftentimes psychoeducation, information about common reactions, information about potential coping skills that people can use, information about where to get other information, where to get assistance, where to get referrals. These oftentimes consist of things like psychological first aid, trauma-informed environments for children, mental health first aid, among others. Moving up the pyramid, we then have targeted interventions. So these can be provided to anybody who fits the specific criteria, and I'll get to that in just a second. But it's typically by those with a background in mental health, not necessarily by a licensed clinician, and there usually is proper training that is required. These interventions oftentimes consist of small group work, or they're targeting a specific reaction, right? So this could be specifically for emotional reactions, for cognitive reactions, for children, for people that went through a specific event, for people who were in a classroom during a school shooting, for instance. And this can include things like skills for psychological recovery, and QPR stands for question, persuade, and refer, which is a suicide assessment. Essentially, these are other non-clinical interventions that focus on a specific group or a specific need. And then lastly, at the top of the pyramid, we have specialized interventions. These are those that are provided by licensed mental health clinicians. This is sort of your traditional trauma treatment, your traditional therapy, and include interventions like EMDR, prolonged exposure therapy, trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy, among other clinical interventions. So as you sort of go up the pyramid, you get more specialized versions of care. And sort of going off of that, I did want to provide some information on types of structured interventions. So these are all types of structured interventions that sort of go to this universal interventions here at the bottom of the pyramid. They're also all interventions that our institute is familiar with and provides trainings on. So if you are interested in learning more about this, we can definitely provide you more information about these. Psychological first aid provides comfort, recognizes basic needs, and helps to solve problems, validates feelings and thoughts of survivors, connects people with their support systems, provides accurate and timely information, covers providing education about stress reactions, and reinforce strengths and positive coping strategies. Essentially, it's an early intervention that can be used by anybody for anybody in the aftermath of a disaster. So you don't need to be a mental health professional to use any of these, but specifically not. You don't have to be a mental health professional to use psychological first aid. Youth mental health first aid. There's also a teen mental health first aid. There's an adult mental health first aid. Our institute focuses mostly on the youth mental health first aid, and they have a 5-step process, which includes approaching and assessing for risk. So really talking about suicide and risk to others. How to listen non-judgmentally, how to give reassurance and information, how to encourage appropriate professional help, and how to encourage self-help and other different self-support strategies. And then we also provide a training on trauma-informed environments, specifically for children. So understanding the impact of trauma on brain development, the unique vulnerabilities of children, how to build an environment that is trauma-informed for kids, the role of caregiver well-being, and sort of how to build a toolbox of coping skills for kids. So these are all trainings that our institute can provide. Most of these are half-day trainings. I believe mental health first aid is a little bit longer. I believe that's a full-day training. My point is that there are structured interventions out there, so you don't have to go and sort of create the wheel if you're looking for something for an intervention to give. I also wanted to provide some information on some practical skills. So these are some of the tools that we train with and things that we suggest as far as ways to practice coping if that's something that you're looking to do. So gratitude journals, right? Being able to sort of hone in on what went well today, things that you're grateful for. This is really sort of hitting on the cognitive side of things, especially if there's cognitive reactions sort of going on. This can help to train your brain to look at not only the negatives, right? It can help you to see the positives in the future, and to sort of help you through the difficult time. Sorry, this is going the wrong way now. There we go. We also have box breathing. So box breathing is a structured breathing technique. So here's an example of a box breathing technique. So essentially you would breathe in for 4 seconds, hold it for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, and then hold that for 4 seconds. This can really go to the emotional side of things, and can really help to help with sort of emotional calming. We also have progressive muscle relaxation. So this is a behavioral skill, which essentially consists of moving through each different muscle group in your body, and tensing and releasing those different muscles, and then working, this one has from feet to head. You can also do head to feet. This is also a technique that you can do that's sort of subtle, right? You can do it in a chair, you can do it during a meeting at work, and it's going to be really hard for people to tell that you're doing it. This can also really help to sort of strengthen the brain-body connection, which can help to sort of re-regulate your body, help tell your body, hey, it's okay, we can, relax those stress hormones now. And then the last one on here, which I don't have a photo for, is guided meditation. So there's a lot of different kinds of guided meditations. If you go on YouTube, you can find a plethora of them. There's a lot of apps out there too, the Calm app. There's another one, starts with Mind something. A lot of those are going to be guided meditations. These are really going to sort of, again, focus on that mind-body connection. It's going to focus on your breathing. It's really going to be sort of a physical coping skill. And the last coping skill I wanted to talk about here is stress inoculation. So stress inoculation is a technique for, similarly to inoculations against illnesses, as sort of a way to strengthen your resilience in the face of a disaster. So the goal with stress inoculation is to manage the stress, not to completely get rid of it, right? You're never going to completely get rid of that, but if you have a plan for how you're going to deal with that stress, you'll be better prepared. So really, this is a preparing in advance for something. So it will help prepare for the realities of an event. It will help you to acknowledge the stress that exists and that it will impact you. It will help you to manage your expectations of the event and of your reactions to the event. It will help to predict the intensity of the emotions, because you're sort of working through the process before the event comes up, that you're likely to experience. And it helps you to practice or mentally prepare for what you might encounter. So this is a 6-step process. First, you're going to break the stressor down into the parts and name them. So the example that we would always use when we do this training is sort of going to your in-laws for the holidays, right? So that's the big stressor. Try to break that down, right? What is it about going to your in-laws for the holidays that stresses you out, right? Maybe it's, someone in your family is going to start talking about politics. Maybe it's that they drink tea and you drink coffee, and you're not going to have your coffee. Maybe it's that your kids are going to be there and they're going to get sugared up and they're going to be crazy, right? So what are the specific things here that are going to be stressing you out? You're then going to take those specific stressors and rate them from 1 to 5, 1 being irritating to 5 being really fear-inducing. That sort of gives you a list of, what is it that I'm most worried about, and what is it that, that I'm not that worried about, that I can deal with if it comes up. You're going to then assess each of those stressors, if you're seeing those as a threat or as a challenge. Oftentimes the ones that might be fear-inducing could be, the ones that you're seeing more as a threat. And you're going to use some of those behavioral and cognitive coping strategies that we talked about in the last slide, for those that are viewed as a threat, and try to reframe those from a threat to a challenge. You're then going to evaluate your level of control over each stressor that you're viewing as a challenge. And for those that you have control over, you're going to use what we call solutions-focused strategies. So making a list, right? Making a list of what you need to do, when you need to do it, Sometimes things can seem really overwhelming in their entirety, but if you're able to sort of, again, break them down into their parts and work down those parts, it can seem a lot more manageable. And then for those that you don't have control over, you're really going to want to tap into some of those emotional coping strategies that we talked about in the last slide, right? So what we always say is, even though you might not have control over the situation, what you always have control over is how you're reacting to it. Right, and that brings us to the end. I did see that there were a couple questions coming in. Let me pull up Q&A.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say that if anyone does have questions, so please just drop them in the Q&A box and we can go through those. Would you like me to read them off for you, Andrew, or are you all set on that?
Sure, just in case other people.
Yeah, of course. So this first one here is, do you think that awareness and access to mental health assistance have changed or improved in recent years? And do you see it changing in the future?
Yes, I do think that it has changed. I do think it has improved. It's definitely made a change for the better. I think that pre-COVID, it was making smaller changes, smaller incremental changes, and now it seems to be improving a lot. I think previously, especially when it comes to the disaster work, disasters didn't impact everybody, and I think COVID changed that. COVID impacted every single person, and so I think everybody at that point was dealing with some of those common reactions, right? I think if we think back to those, especially those first couple months of COVID, I mean, there was a lot of those on there that I definitely had, right? So I think everybody sort of saw the importance of mental health when challenges arise. And so I think because of that, there is a big push now towards improving mental health services. I know specifically in the county that I live in Ulster County, actually at the beginning of COVID, they actually closed one of our psychiatric hospitals to turn it into a COVID hospital, and are now just changing it back to a mental health facility because they saw that that need was really big and there wasn't enough coverage in our area. So I do see it changing. I do see it improving, and there are people at work trying to get this, trying to get this improved. There's also been a lot of legislation as well around access to care, who can access care. Yeah, and to that point, also related to insurance, diagnosis, who can make diagnoses, all of that thing have been changing at a policy level as well. I will say too, our director actually had a conversation with some colleagues today at the White House about delivering some content to their staff. So I think what we're seeing here is sort of top down, right? I mean, that's the the most important office in the country, and they're contacting us to say, hey, we're seeing the mental health need and we want to provide these services to people. So I think that is definitely been changing.
That's great to hear. Thank you. I don't see any other questions coming in. If anyone has any last minute questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box, or if you are entering anything into the chat, make sure that that's set to send to everyone, please. And not seeing anything. Andrew, this is really great. Thank you so much for being here and being part of the webinar series. Really
Yeah, of course.
appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Amanda. And if anybody wants to find more information, our website is right here, newpaltz.edu/idmh. It is a little bit old. We're actually trying to update that currently at the moment. You can find information there about these various different kinds of trainings that we do, other kinds of projects, other initiatives, information about our conference, all of that. And if there's any questions that anybody would like to email me, I also included my email address on here as well.
Excellent. And I am going to go ahead and send a link to the recording out after this to the folks who registered, so I can include the link to your website and your email address as well.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you again. And thank you everyone for being here. I hope you all have a great night. Here.